January 1942, near Vyazma, west of Moscow. The sun climbs slowly over a white, motionless plain, its light catching on the frozen bodies of horses, lined along a narrow forest road. Their breath had once clouded the morning air in thick plumes. Now only the wind moves between them, scattering ice crystals across abandoned wagons. German infantry press forward on numb feet, hauling crates by hand because the teams that pulled them through Poland and deep into Russia have collapsed in the cold. The sound is muted, wood creaking, boots crunching, distant artillery, yet the strain is unmistakable. Every step is theft from the strength they need to fight. Thousands of kilometers away and 2 years later, a different rhythm will dominate the European war, the steady mechanical roar of American engines. Convoys of standardized trucks, loaded with fuel, shells and rations, will carve uninterrupted lines across liberated France. Horses here, engines there. Two armies bound to the same war, divided by the systems that fed their advance. Germany entered the Second World War, carrying the weight of an unresolved logistical past. The empire that collapsed in 1918 left behind an army that had never fully mechanized, an industry that rebuilt under restrictions, and a doctrine that imagined rapid campaigns but lacked the material foundation to sustain them. By 1939, the Wehrmacht possessed armored divisions and fast-moving motorized infantry, but these formations were only the sharp edge of a force still anchored to the 19th century. The image of blitzkrieg masked a deeper reality. Behind every tank column trailed long lines of horses pulling guns, fodder, fuel, and food. Industrial limits defined this reliance. Germany produced skilled machinery in small batches but lacked the mass manufacturing capacity of the United States. Standardization remained elusive. Truck models varied by factory, part compatibility was inconsistent, and production numbers fell far below the requirements of a continental war. Even before the invasion of Poland, planners knew motorization was incomplete. Vehicles consumed steel, rubber, and fuel Germany could not guarantee. Horses, by contrast, required only fodder, something Germany could seize or requisition across occupied lands. The logic was brutal but practical. In a war built on expansion, living transport solved shortages engines could not. Mobilization orders reflected that calculation. By September 1939, more than 500,000 horses served the Wehrmacht. Artillery regiments depended on them. Infantry divisions were structured around them. Supply columns advanced at their pace, not the pace of the armored spearheads that defined propaganda films. Even in France in 1940, often remembered as a triumph of mechanized warfare, most German units marched behind horse-drawn wagons. Speed came from the narrow corridors where tanks broke through. Endurance came from the animal labor that followed. When Germany turned eastward in June, 1941, the scale of reliance expanded further. The invasion of the Soviet Union demanded supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers across territory with almost no usable infrastructure. Soviet rail gauges differed. Bridges were inadequate. Roads dissolved in rain and heat. In this environment, the Wehrmacht deployed roughly 750,000 horses at the outset, with numbers rising steadily as losses mounted and distances grew. Each horse required around 10 kilograms of fodder per day. Each wagon required teams capable of surviving climate extremes unfamiliar to Central Europe. Every kilometer advanced increased the strain on these animals as sharply as it did on the men guiding them. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa concealed the weakness. Armored divisions smashed frontier defenses, captured vast pockets of Soviet troops, and pushed toward Minsk and Smolensk. But behind them, horse columns stretched thin across roads choked with dust. Animals weakened under heat, shortages, and exhaustion. Veterinarians reported mounting cases of disease. Fodder quotas proved unrealistic. Supply deliveries slowed. The army's vanguard accelerated. The army's lifeline lagged. Autumn rains exposed the system completely. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud, turned dirt roads into viscous channels. Trucks bogged down, but horses suffered more. Hooves sank deep, tendons strained, wagons toppled sideways into ditches. Progress, measured in kilometers per day, shrank to meters per hour. Units resorted to slaughtering animals for meat because they could no longer move them. Every dead horse represented lost mobility, lost firepower, lost food transport, lost medical evacuation capacity. The front pushed outward, while its sustaining network decayed behind it. Winter completed the damage. Temperatures plunged. Frost penetrated stable lines. Animals without adequate shelter or forage died by the thousands. German divisions that needed constant resupply to maintain offensive pressure instead fought to maintain basic existence. Ammunition deliveries failed. Fuel trucks froze in place. Horse carcasses lined the approaches to Moscow. The army that had crossed the border expecting quick victory now bled strength because its supply foundation could not survive the climate or the distance. What remained was a widening gap between operational ambition and logistical capability. Each attempt to push deeper into Soviet territory stretched supply columns further, exposed animals longer, and depleted division strength faster. German doctrine imagined decisive campaigns. The material structure of the army made those campaigns unsustainable. By early 1942, commanders no longer questioned the bravery of their troops or the performance of their tanks. They questioned how to move food, ammunition, and fuel to the front before horses collapsed and roads failed. Across the Atlantic, the United States approached the same war with a fundamentally different foundation. Its geography insulated it. Rom invasion. Its industry operated at continental scale. Its automotive sector had spent decades perfecting mass production, standardization, and interchangeable parts. When war demands surged, the infrastructure already existed to convert assembly lines into military channels. In 1940, the United States ranked as the world's largest producer of automobiles. By 1943, it became the largest producer of military trucks in history. American motorization was not a wartime improvisation, it was the residue of an industrial culture built around engines. Farmers drove tractors. Businesses owned delivery trucks. Highways linked cities. Mechanical literacy ran through civilian life. When the U.S. Army expanded, it did so with an assumption Germany could not match. Mobility would be mechanized at every level. Each division, each regiment, each supply unit would rely on standardized trucks requiring predictable fuel, predictable parts, and predictable maintenance cycles. This approach matured into the Quartermaster Corps' central doctrine. The Army standardized its primary vehicles, the 212-ton truck, the 112-ton truck, and the 3-4-ton utility vehicle. Interchangeable components simplified repairs. Mechanics trained on uniform systems. Depots stocked identical parts. Where Germany fielded dozens of truck models from fragmented manufacturers, the United States fielded a streamlined fleet built for replacement, not preservation. Efficiency mattered more than tradition. Production volumes reinforced this advantage. American factories produced hundreds of thousands of trucks annually. By the time U.S. forces landed in North Africa in 1942, the logistical network accompanying them already possessed redundancy Germany could not replicate. Ship convoys delivered vehicles faster than the enemy could destroy them. Fuel arrived in drums, tankers, and pipelines. Workshops operated with full toolkits. Losses were absorbed without structural damage. These strengths became decisive after D-Day. Once Allied forces broke out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, frontline units advanced faster than pre-existing rail lines could support. A new system was needed, one capable of sustaining an army in continuous motion. The answer was the Red Ball Express. The concept was simple: dedicate thousands of trucks to a non-stop supply loop from Normandy depots to forward positions in France. The execution required discipline. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers restricted from combat roles, moved day and night along controlled roads where only supply convoys were allowed. Military police regulated traffic. Maintenance crews staged along the route. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and spare parts flowed continuously. In a single day, the Red Ball Express could deliver tens of thousands of tons of materiel. Germany had no equivalent. The influence extended beyond quantity. American logistics retained momentum during weather shifts, terrain changes, and operational fluctuations. Rucks navigated wet ground, repaired bridges, bypassed destroyed infrastructure, and maintained pace with frontline units. They did not require fodder. They did not collapse from exhaustion. They did not freeze. They consumed fuel, and the United States ensured that fuel arrived. This mechanized reliability reshaped operations. Commanders could plan offensives knowing supplies would meet intent. Armored divisions could exploit breakthroughs without waiting for animal columns to catch up. Infantry units received winter clothing, medical equipment, and ammunition before shortages appeared. Air forces operated with stable fuel deliveries. Support services expanded as rapidly as combat formations moved. German commanders studied this contrast with growing alarm. Their supply arms deteriorated under seasonal extremes. American logistics accelerated under the same conditions. By late 1944, the disparity was not measured in horses versus trucks, it was measured in operational freedom versus operational confinement. One army sustained initiative, the other attempted to survive the consequences of its structural decisions. This divergence created two parallel timelines in the same war. Germany fought with an inherited system stretched across impossible distances. The United States fought with a modernized system designed for industrial speed. Both faced the same demands of global conflict, but only one possessed the mobility infrastructure to sustain continuous offensive warfare. German soldiers lived inside a logistical world built on muscle, not machinery. Horse handlers, Reitknechte, drivers spent their days feeding, brushing, shoeing, and calming animals that reacted to artillery, cold and starvation, with the same fragility as any living creature. A gun crew's effectiveness depended not only on training, but on the health of the 6 to 8 horses pulling its limber. When supply distances stretched, men walked beside wagons for hours, reins in numb hands, boots sinking into mud thick enough to pull soles loose. Nights offered no rest. Horses needed tending before soldiers ate or slept. Snowstorms demanded constant checking to prevent frostbite in legs and muzzles. Disease meant endless triage, glanders, intestinal infections, respiratory collapse. A dead horse meant a broken supply line, and a broken supply line meant a silent gun. Men pulled wagons themselves when animals faltered, straining through terrain that engines would have crossed easily. Human exhaustion mirrored animal exhaustion, and both accelerated each other. The war's front line drew strength from rear echelons, and those rear echelons bled strength through the daily grind required to keep millions of horses alive long enough to move a single artillery shell a few kilometers. This human-animal dependency shaped morale as much as combat did. Horse-drawn supply systems imposed hard ceilings on operational tempo. When armored divisions lunged forward, their momentum outran supply column. MNS almost immediately. Panzers that advanced 60 kilometers in a day relied on wagons capable of only 20. Fuel drums stacked miles behind breakthroughs created bottlenecks impossible to clear quickly. Delays compounded. Ammunition arrived late. Medical supplies arrived late, bridging equipment arrived late. Commanders planned offensives around the slowest component of their force, not the fastest. Artillery firepower hinged on horse stamina. When animals weakened, guns stopped, regardless of tactical opportunity. Retreats suffered the same constraints. Horses panicked under fire, tangled harnesses and blocked roads already clogged with refugees and wreckage. A single dead team could immobilize an entire column. Mobility in modern war required synchronization between speed, weight, and endurance. German tactics excelled in the first category. German logistics operated in the last. The mismatch shaped every campaign. The Eastern Front's climate punished horses with a severity engines never feared. Summer heat dehydrated teams rapidly as wagons climbed dusty Belarusian roads. Swarms of insects infected open sores. Autumn rains turned movement into brute force, hauling through waist-deep sludge. Winter frost froze hooves to the ground overnight. Snow-blinded animals already weakened by malnutrition. German veterinary units recorded catastrophic losses, tens of thousands per month during peak periods. Each loss rippled outward. More horses removed from service meant more wagons abandoned, more supplies delayed, more divisions weakened at the edge of their endurance. Environmental exposure sharpened the structural flaw in Germany's strategic thinking. An army built for short, decisive campaigns became trapped in a continental war defined by distance and extreme seasons. Every shift in weather carved pieces out of its supply arm until only fragments remained capable of movement. This erosion shaped the operational landscape that followed. American logistics drew strength from repetition, not improvisation. The standardized 212-ton truck, the backbone of U.S. supply, performed with predictable endurance across mud, frost and crushed village roads. Engines tolerated long idling. Transmissions accepted harsh gear changes from inexperienced drivers. Tires endured rubble-strewn lanes that would have crippled lighter vehicles. Mechanics worked inside a system built for speed, identical parts, uniform manuals, and depots arranged in layers of depth. When a truck failed, crews stripped it, replaced components, and returned it to service within hours. Nothing in this chain depended on weather-sensitive fodder or fragile animal physiology. The trucks demanded fuel, and American supply lines delivered that fuel with industrial consistency. This stability created an operational rhythm. While German columns stopped to rest, feed, and reshoe animals, U.S. convoys continued without interruption. The result was cumulative rather than dramatic, an expanding logist. ICAL margin that widened every week. Over time, that margin became a decisive tool of warfare, allowing American units to maintain pressure, maintain mobility, and maintain tempo without the collapses that stalked horse-dependent armies. Reliability became an operational weapon. American logistics functioned as a controlled environment. Military police regulated supply routes with precision. Convoys traveled in regulated intervals, headlights shielded, engines synchronized. Fuel depots extended behind the front in layered echelons, each supplying the next. Repair units floated between them, pulling disabled trucks off the road before traffic accumulated. This constant clearing prevented the paralysis that plagued German horse-drawn columns when a single wagon collapsed. Road management mattered as much as raw tonnage. U.S. forces secured bridges, resurfaced lanes, redirected flow, and enforced one-way systems along the Red Ball Express. Every kilometer became part of a designed logistical organism. German divisions, by contrast, moved through uncontrolled road networks shared with refugees, livestock, and damaged equipment. Congestion became a normal state. The Americans turned roads into arteries. The Germans endured roads as obstacles. This divergence transformed operational endurance, shaping the pace at which each army could react, reinforce, and strike. Soviet and Allied intelligence recognized the asymmetry early. Reports from the Eastern Front noted German columns bogged down by dead horses, stalled wagons, and abandoned guns. Soviet commanders exploited this by launching counterattacks when supply starvation peaked. In Normandy, German officers watched Allied truck convoys pour inland and understood the scale of their disadvantage. The enemy's mobility remained uninterrupted. Even when German forces struck at American supply lines, the standardized nature of U.S. equipment allowed rapid replacement. Destroyed trucks simply reappeared in new batches. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed a growing German despair. Their operations were measured against an opponent whose logistical base expanded faster than losses could diminish it. This perception fed into strategic paralysis. German high command planned offensives they could not sustain while watching an enemy sustain offensives they could not stop. The war's turning points took shape inside this psychological imbalance long before the decisive moments arrived on the battlefield. The German advance toward Moscow in late 1941 revealed the breaking point of a logistics system already stretched beyond design. What began in June as a rapid, brutal push across Belarus and Western Russia hardened into a slow-motion struggle against distance, exhaustion, and collapse. By October, the momentum that carried armored spearheads through Smolensk had fractured. Supply lines lengthened into vulnerable strands. Horse columns weakened into immobile masses, and the thin operational marg. In that sustained, the campaign evaporated. Operation Typhoon opened with promise. Panzer groups broke Soviet defenses around Vyazma and Bryansk, creating vast encirclements. At the front, the battlefield seemed to replay the victories of the summer, yet behind the lines the supply apparatus decayed. Rain transformed roads into liquid clay. Horses pulled until their legs trembled, then fell. Wagons sank axle-deep, abandoned where they stuck. Fuel and ammunition, essential for the final approach to Moscow, piled up far to the rear, unreachable by formations that needed them most. The deeper the Wehrmacht advanced, the more its animal-based logistics disintegrated. Veterinary units issued emergency reports, thousands of horses dying weekly, many unfit for work even if kept alive. Fodder requirements soared while availability plummeted. Requisition teams scoured villages already stripped bare. Starvation overtook horses before frost did. Infantry divisions reliant on horse teams for artillery movement faced the consequences immediately. Guns fell silent not because of enemy fire, but because the animals that hauled them lay dead along the roadside. By November, winter arrived without transition. Temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius. Horses froze in harness, their bodies rigid by dawn. Wagons became ice-bound monuments. Drivers beat their hands against their chests to maintain sensation, then used frozen ropes to drag carcasses off narrow paths so that remaining supply elements could pass. The loss of each horse reduced carrying capacity, but now the losses came in waves, crippling entire regiments overnight. The effects rippled outward. Panzer divisions reached the outskirts of Moscow with fuel reserves measured in hours. Artillery units rationed shells because resupply had slowed to a crawl. Infantry marched hungry as supply officers cut rations to preserve what little remained. Commanders saw their tactical opportunities shrink with every day that logistical endurance eroded. The offensive spirit celebrated in German doctrine found no footing in an environment where the supply arm could not survive the climate. When the Soviet counteroffensive opened on 5 December 1941, the Wehrmacht's logistical system was already failing. Horses that survived the advance could no longer move artillery for withdrawal. Frozen wagons blocked escape routes. Units attempting to reposition faced an impossible choice: abandon heavy weapons or remain trapped. Many abandoned them. The winter storm struck an army already hollowed out by its reliance on animal transport in a theater that tolerated no weakness. Retreat magnified the collapse. Horses panicked under Soviet artillery, twisting wagons sideways across narrow forest roads. Drivers cut harnesses to free surviving animals, sacrificing equipment to save mobility. Those efforts often failed. Soviet ski battalions exploited the immobilization, striking stalled columns, capturing supplies and scatter. Remnants. The retreat from Moscow became an extended exposure to cold, hunger, and ceaseless logistical breakdown. By January 1942, German divisions reported catastrophic transport losses. Some infantry regiments retained fewer than 10% of their original horses. Artillery movements slowed to the pace of manual labor. Engineers burned abandoned wagons for heat. Commanders blamed climate, distance, and enemy resistance. But the core failure remained structural. The Army's supply system was built on living transport, unsuited to the vastness and severity of the Eastern Front. What emerged from this collapse was not merely a stalled offensive, but a strategic fracture. Germany's hope for a quick victory died alongside the animals that had pulled its guns and rations toward Moscow. The logistically induced halt destroyed initiative, exhausted reserves, and opened a permanent deficit that no future mechanization efforts could fully repair. This breaking point stands in direct contrast to the mechanized continuity developing in Western Europe, where American logistics prepared to demonstrate the opposite trajectory. The Allied breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944 demonstrated what mechanized logistics could achieve when integrated into strategy, terrain control, and industrial momentum. The U.S. Army, having secured beachheads and pushed inland through the Bocage, faced a critical challenge. Exploiting the collapse of German defenses required instant mobility. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support needed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts at a pace that rail lines could not yet provide. The answer was already waiting. Rows of standardized trucks lining Normandy's improvised depots, engines idling, ready to transform operational opportunity into sustained advance. When Operation Cobra ruptured German positions south of Saint-Lô, the front expanded with sudden velocity. American armored divisions surged forward, crossing distances in days that would have taken weeks under traditional supply methods. The Red Ball Express, activated in August, became the artery that fed this momentum. Thousands of trucks, most of them 2-ton GMCs, began a continuous circulation from Cherbourg and other supply ports to forward logistics hubs near the rapidly moving front. Convoys ran day and night. Military police restricted road usage exclusively to these supply lines, ensuring no blockage, no hesitation, no slowing of the mechanical flow. Each convoy carried fuel drums stacked in precise weight distributions, ammunition crated for rapid offload, rations packed for entire divisions. Maintenance points positioned along the route operated as mechanical triage stations. Trucks rolled in damaged, rolled out repaired. Those beyond saving were cannibalized for parts. The system never paused. The effect on operations was immediate. Patton's Third Army advanced with a continuity unseen in German campaigns. Fuel arrived ahead of armored spearheads. Artillery received ammunition stocks before fire missions began. Infantry moved with full kit because trucks delivered replacements in steady cycles. Bridges destroyed by retreating German forces failed to halt pursuit. The engineers accompanying the logistical network rebuilt crossings while convoys rerouted around obstacles. In every direction, mobility reinforced mobility. German commanders observed this expansion with disbelief. Their own supply lines in France, fractured under Allied air superiority, destroyed bridges and fuel shortages. Horses abandoned by retreating formations littered roadsides. Trucks ran dry within kilometers of depots. Meanwhile, American convoys pushed forward with industrial certainty, feeding an army that now operated with strategic acceleration. The contrast between 8 million German horses and thousands of American trucks became more than a statistic. It became a lived battlefield difference that shaped every encounter. By late August, the pace of advance outstripped even the planners' expectations. The Red Ball Express delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day at its peak. No army in history had ever moved materiel so far so quickly with such reliability. German counterattacks, such as the Mortain attempt, failed partly because US divisions received reinforcements and ammunition faster than German units could position themselves. Every American movement carried the weight of a logistical system that did not tire, did not freeze, and did not weaken under environmental pressure. As the Allies liberated Paris and continued toward Belgium, the mechanical rhythm of US logistics transformed operational planning. Commanders no longer constrained themselves to the limitations of distance or weather. Strategic decisions aligned with the assumption of reliable supply. Mobility became routine. Continuous pressure became standard practice. Retreating German forces faced an opponent whose momentum no longer depended on brief windows of opportunity. It was sustained by an entire logistical architecture built for relentless forward movement. Even when the Allied drive approached temporary pauses, such as fuel shortages caused by port limitations, the system adapted. Convoys shifted routes, prioritized delivery categories, and rebalanced distribution. American logistics displayed flexibility within structure, a trait that living transport could never match. Reliability combined with tempo. Tempo combined with weight, and weight combined with overwhelming operational effect. By autumn 1944, Germany's dwindling mobility contrasted sharply with American expansion. One army looked backward, trapped by its own infrastructure, while the other pressed forward under the power of engines built in factories half a world away. The divergence in movement speed, sustainment endurance, and operational reach became irreversible. This mechanized surge shaped not only battlefield outcomes but the final trajectory of the war itself, preparing he ground for the consequences that unfolded in the months that followed. The consequences of these contrasting logistics systems became starkly evident as 1944 drew to a close. Germany's reliance on horses left its armies increasingly brittle, unable to sustain offensive operations or recover from losses. Reports from the Eastern and Western fronts documented staggering attrition. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost over 1.5 million horses to starvation, disease, and exposure since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. Artillery units struggled to redeploy guns, infantry divisions marched without sufficient rations, and supply officers documented gaps that could no longer be patched by requisitioning local resources. Every collapsed horse team meant a ton of supplies stranded, equipment immobile, or medical support delayed. The systemic failure undermined operational flexibility, forcing the German high command into defensive postures even in situations where tactical opportunities existed. In contrast, the United States mechanized supply network maintained operational pressure without comparable strain. The Red Ball Express, at its peak, delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies per day along regulated routes from Normandy to advancing front lines. The system's scalability allowed armored and infantry divisions to exploit breakthroughs rapidly, sustain pursuit, and maintain combat readiness. The contrast in sustainment capacity directly influenced battlefield outcomes. German counterattacks faltered not purely because of manpower or tactics, but because their logistics could not keep pace with advancing Allied units. Armored formations halted for lack of fuel. Infantry units suffered shortages of ammunition and rations. Entire sectors of the front became operationally paralyzed, while American convoys rolled forward uninterrupted. The cumulative effect reshaped the strategic landscape. Germany's inability to sustain forces over extended distances undermined defensive cohesion, leaving gaps exploited by Allied advances in France and Belgium. Soviet offensives benefited similarly on the Eastern Front, as stretched supply lines and exhausted horses limited German countermeasures. By the winter of 1944-45, the operational initiative had permanently shifted. Where German logistics imposed ceilings on movement, American mechanics enabled near-continuous mobility, allowing combined arms operations to function at their full potential. Infrastructure and resource management were decisive. American convoys moved along roads improved and secured specifically for logistics. Maintenance units repaired vehicles in the field, with spare parts standardized across thousands of trucks. Fuel pipelines, repair depots, and supply echelons operated with redundancy. Every element of this network was designed to absorb loss without halting operations. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, could replace neither horses nor wagons at the required scale. The physical and organization. Difference created a material advantage that extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping operational planning, offensive reach, and morale. Reports and records underscore this disparity. After the liberation of Belgium, Allied intelligence captured German documents highlighting the collapse of transport capacity. Eastern Front field reports described entire infantry regiments immobilized, artillery batteries abandoned, and cavalry units, historically an elite branch, reduced to scavenging fodder for survival. On the American side, quartermaster logs show uninterrupted deliveries across hundreds of kilometers of moving front, reinforcing divisions without incident. The numerical data reflects human and mechanical realities. 8 million German horses versus 6,000 trucks may appear similar in abstract terms, but operational impact was exponential. One system failed under environmental, temporal, and combat pressures. The other leveraged industrialization and standardization to maintain relentless forward momentum. The contrast extended beyond quantity. Reliability, flexibility, and repairability defined the functional effectiveness of American supply, while German reliance on animals imposed vulnerability at every step. In practice, mechanization created strategic freedom, enabling commanders to exploit opportunities, coordinate multi-division maneuvers, and maintain operational initiative. Horse-based logistics constrained decision-making, imposed rigid timelines, and generated cumulative attrition invisible in daily combat, but decisive over weeks and months. This divergence laid the foundation for the final phase of the war in Europe, illustrating that victory depended as much on the means of supply as on the means of combat. The operational collapse of horse-reliant systems and the success of mechanized logistics shaped post-war military thinking, prompting a reassessment of mobility, industrial support, and the integration of supply into strategy. Germany's experiences demonstrated the limitations of living transport under extreme conditions. American achievements proved the potential of mechanized sustainment to determine tempo, operational reach, and ultimately strategic outcome. This disparity naturally leads into the economic, doctrinal, and psychological consequences that followed, further cementing the logistical lessons of the war. The operational collapse of German horse-based logistics carried profound economic and doctrinal consequences. Each lost horse represented not only a diminished transport capacity, but also a sunk cost in feed, labor, and equipment. By 1945, Germany had expended more than 3 million horses across all theaters of war, a figure that exceeded the replacement capacity of its agricultural and industrial systems. Veterinary services, previously tasked with maintenance and rehabilitation, were overwhelmed. Local populations were requisitioned to supply fodder, further straining occupied regions. The inability to suster in animal transport disrupted production schedules, reduced the efficiency of supply distribution, and ultimately accelerated the erosion of Germany's frontline capabilities. American mechanization, in contrast, demonstrated the economic multiplier of industrial scale. Thousands of trucks produced in uniform factories reduced maintenance complexity, shortened repair times, and minimized downtime. Fuel logistics, though challenging, relied on standardized drums, pipelines, and transport convoys that could be rerouted or expanded with minimal disruption. The United States' wartime economy absorbed losses of vehicles without endangering operational tempo. This industrial flexibility not only ensured the flow of men and materiel, but also shaped post-war military doctrine. Mechanization was no longer auxiliary, but central to modern combat operations. Strategically, the divergence affected both battlefield outcomes and planning psychology. German commanders recognized the limits imposed by reliance on horses. Offensive operations increasingly became defensive or reactive, constrained by the distance supplies could travel and the endurance of their animals. Commanders measured opportunity in days of mobility rather than enemy positions. Conversely, American planners operated with the assumption of continuous resupply, enabling rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, sustained pressure on retreating forces, and the coordination of multi-corps operations across extended fronts. The psychological impact extended to soldiers and officers alike. On the German side, exhaustion from manual labor, exposure to cold, and witnessing the collapse of horse columns undermined morale. Supply failures became tactical liabilities that diminished confidence in leadership and operational plans. Among American forces, reliable logistics created predictability and confidence. Soldiers knew fuel, ammunition, and food would arrive on schedule, enabling focus on combat tasks rather than survival or improvisation. These lessons reshaped post-war military thinking. Armies recognized that industrialized, standardized, and mechanized supply chains were essential not only for operational success, but also for strategic flexibility. The Red Ball Express and its contemporaries became models for logistics planning, inspiring doctrines that integrated mobility, repair, and sustainment as inseparable from combat operations. Germany's collapse underscored the hazards of adhering to outdated transport paradigms, particularly in theaters characterized by extreme distances, climate, and attritional warfare. Ultimately, the logistical contrast demonstrated that industrial and mechanized advantage could determine the tempo and outcome of conflict as decisively as tactical innovation or numerical superiority. Where horses faltered under distance and weather, trucks maintained momentum. Where Germany's army slowed, American forces surged. The war's trajectory and the decisive liberation of Western Europe rested as much on the engineering of supply lines as on the battles themselves. The operational, economic, and psychological consequences of these systems set the stage for reflection on the broader meaning of mobility, mechanization, and industrial capacity in modern warfare. The contrast between Germany's reliance on horses and America's mechanized supply highlights a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Victory is inseparable from the capacity to sustain it. Horses embodied endurance and tradition, yet they were fragile instruments, bound to climate, terrain, and the limits of human management. Their collapse in the forests and plains of the Eastern Front illustrated how an army's strength is only as reliable as the systems that move its firepower, food, and medicine. In January 1942, German forces faced not just the enemy but the material consequences of centuries-old logistical methods pushed to the breaking point. America's 6,000 trucks, backed by industrial scale, standardization, and meticulous planning, embodied a new paradigm. Mobility became continuous, predictable, and adaptable. Where horses died in mud and frost, engines pressed forward. Where human hands struggled to drag wagons, mechanics replaced parts, refueled, and restarted. The mechanized supply network was not merely a tool, it was a force multiplier, shaping decisions at every level, enabling rapid exploitation and sustaining initiative across hundreds of kilometers. The operational freedom afforded by trucks created conditions under which speed, endurance, and strategy merged. This divergence left a lasting imprint on military thought. Warfare was no longer measured solely in soldiers, guns, or tanks. It was measured in the reliability, flexibility, and resilience of supply chains. Industrial capacity and mechanized logistics became as decisive as battlefield tactics, turning the science of war into an integrated system of men, machines, and materials. The fate of the Wehrmacht and the advance of American forces demonstrated that technological infrastructure could determine the tempo, reach, and ultimately the outcome of conflict. In the end, the story of 8 million horses and 6,000 trucks is a story of adaptation, foresight, and consequence. One army was bound by tradition and circumstance, the other empowered by industry and standardization. The lessons resonate beyond the battlefields of Europe. Mobility, sustainment, and logistical foresight define not only the success of armies, but the very character of modern war. The past is encoded in frozen plains and roaring engines alike, a testament to the decisive power of movement itself.